joining us today. We're going to talk about addressing English language learners' learning needs in the classroom. I'm Casey Medlock-Paul, a former Spanish teacher with a master's degree in second language acquisition and teaching. I've worked with a lot of English language learners in the past, so now I'm trying to research and learn a little bit more and share my knowledge with you.
Hi, my name is Norm Bihapovich, and I'm a former ESL student myself, and I'm also a former teacher. I worked with second grade struggling readers as well as ELL students in South Korea. So as you can imagine, this hits very close to home, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. Have you ever wondered how many ELLs there are and why we should address their needs? Well, I just wanted to share some numbers with you. For example, there are 60, the number of ELLs have risen by 60% in the US, which is a national growth of 7%. During the 2012 and 2013 class year, ELLs comprised 10% of the total student population, and by 2030, it's expected that 25% of the students will be ELLs. And just to demonstrate again, it's sometimes we assume that ELLs are immigrant students and that they're not U.S. citizens, but that's actually not true because 85% of K through 5 ELLs were born in the U.S., as well as 62% of 6th through 12th grade students. And specifically in our own state, ELLs comprise of 102,311 students, and amongst the top 15 U.S. states with the highest ELL student density, North Carolina ranks at number 8. So as you can imagine, that number is pretty significant, and that's something we should consider about as educators.
Strengths are that a lot of ELLs have families that are committed to the students' lives and futures. These families have moved from different areas to give their children better opportunities, both in education and for a career. So that's something they really bring with them into the classroom. They also have a lot of family support. Education is really valued by these families. Again, that's one of the reasons they come here. And so this child has one of the biggest needs of our students, family support and a belief that education is very valuable. Because of that, the students often are very interested in learning and being educated. They're very motivated. These students will also bring content knowledge and academic skills in their native language. And while these skills will not necessarily be the same ones that we teach in our classroom, and they definitely won't necessarily speak the same language that we're teaching in our classroom, these students do have knowledge and skills. So it's important to know that they often have the same knowledge of, they have phonemic awareness, they know the alphabet in their native language, they know similar principles and concepts, they just know it in a different way. And also these students have literacy skills in their native language. A lot of students are able to read and write in their native language, so they just simply need to make this transfer between their native language and English. So some of the challenges they face, the students may have limited experience with academic language. As you can see here, some students potentially have little or no formal schooling, which means they don't necessarily have the difference between how you speak at home and how you speak in the classroom. They will, of course, know their own native language. It just may not be in the academic sense, so that may be some difficulty they face as they come into school, not knowing English and not knowing academic English on top of that. These students often have a high mobility rate, especially for migrant farming families, so they have a lot of experience with moving and they're not necessarily living in the same place for long, so this is an added stress on their life, which can make it difficult to learn in the classroom. They also are learning different things in different classrooms, so it's really hard to retain knowledge if they're having some gaps when they move. Some students have a lot of home responsibilities, such as caring for their siblings while their parents work. They may work a job themselves to help their families make ends meet, and they also may be translating for their family as they learn English if their family does not learn English at the same time. So it's very important to consider that they're facing all of this as they go. And added to that, almost 60% of English language learners are from low-income families with parents of limited education. So this is an added challenge for these students as they go forth. And as we know, poverty and working extra jobs, caring for siblings, all of that can add extra stress onto the student. And stress is linked with over 50% of all absences. It can impair attention and concentration, reduce cognition, creativity, and memory, can diminish social skills and social judgment, which can really hinder your development of English, and then can reduce motivation, determination, effort, as well as the growth of new brain cells. So all of this really can make learning difficult for students. So it's important to know where they're coming from and what they're bringing into your classroom as you try to begin to teach them English as well as the academic skills that you're supposed to be teaching. Okay, it takes 5 to 7 years to acquire academic English. That's a really long time, so you can't expect your students to learn it in a year or even 2 years. You should know that students will acquire social English much quicker. So if you have students who are speaking English well but can't read very well or write very well, that's because it is normal for social English to come much quicker than academic English. Know that your students may go through a silent period in which they don't talk a lot, but know that they are listening and learning. This is a perfectly natural process of the language learning experience, so allow them to listen and learn and speak when they feel comfortable and ready. It's also important to know that an English language learner's culture and language affect their behavior, their beliefs, and their background knowledge. For instance, a student may behave in a certain way because that's appropriate to their culture. They may also believe certain things that are different. They may have religious beliefs or other cultural beliefs that affect how they interact with students and how they interact with the teacher. It's important to know also that knowledge and beliefs are socially constructed rather than objective. For example, how many continents are here? There are 7. You should be familiar with this idea. But how many continents are here? There are 5. Some areas define the idea of a continent differently than we do here in the United States. For some cultures and some countries, Eurasia is one continent, and North America and South America is also one continent because a canal, in their opinion, does not divide continents. So it's just important to know that if your student tells you something like there are 5 continents, they're not necessarily wrong, they're just thinking differently than we do here.
It's also very important to consider our students' culture, so we don't want to approach it with a deficit mindset. So, for example, I want to share a quote with you here that might demonstrate a deficit mindset. For example, my English language learner student doesn't raise her hand. She must not care about my class. So that would be, for example, an approach to look at the ELL student perhaps from a deficit perspective. So I want to challenge you to consider that. For example, culture drives behavior. We also believe that cultural norms of ELLs may be different from the mainstream students and from the mainstream culture as well. And also we want to encourage you to consider that your students' culture and family background might be significantly different from the other students and maybe from your own as an educator. So for example, to reinforce all of this, consider that your student may go home and they may or may not hear things that are completely different from your experiences. For example, your student might hear, don't use your left hand, or don't speak unless you're called upon, or you shouldn't look at boys like that. So all of these elements are important to consider when looking at your ELL and considering his or her culture. In today's classrooms, students are expected to read across various platforms. For example, students are expected to read print text, but they're also reading across websites, and they're reading across, they're reading on devices such as handheld devices. So it's very important to consider your students, especially your ELL students, because how are they reading, and how are we as educators supporting them in their effort to read? So we identify 5 elements that we encourage you to consider. For example, written elements include vocabulary and grammar, and visual elements include images. Audio elements, for example, include pitch and volume, and music if you're using that as a teaching element. Spatial elements include aspects such as proximity, direction, and position of the layout. Some examples that we encourage you to use would be multi or bilingual books are excellent to use. Also, students are reading across websites and picture books, so all of these are wonderful elements to consider when reading comes into play across various platforms. In order to help your ELLs in the classroom, we encourage you to find out about them as much as you can. So some questions that you may consider might be, what country or region is he or she from? What language does he or she speak? Did they attend school before now? If so, for how long? Can they read in their native language? If so, what level are they at?
It's important to think about how you might find out these answers to these questions as well, because if they're an English language learner, you can't just ask them. However, many families fill out forms when they register for school, and they might have filled out these forms in their native language or had a translator for them. So your administrator or counselor might have this information. You also can be very creative in how you find out this information. For instance, if you want to find out if a student can read in their native language, you might want to get a book or print out some text from online and see if they can read it. Students who can read text often behave very differently with a book than students who are just looking at pictures. So you might want to observe them. You can also use Google Translate and type in an answer and see if they can read it and respond back, and then translate it in English to get the answer. So these are just some ideas of ways you can find this out. While you may not be able to find out everything, you do need to find out as much as you can so you know where they're coming from and the knowledge that they bring with them. The best strategies you can use is direct vocabulary instruction. Lack of vocabulary is one of the biggest issues that English language learners face. For that reason, they really need direct teaching of words and strategies that help them make meaning of words that they encounter in text. For instance, you might want to teach them cognate knowledge, so learning how to recognize words that are similar in their native language to English words and that mean similar things. These might be words that sound the same or look similar. You also want to teach them morphological information, so ideas like adding an S makes a word plural, or adding an ED makes it past tense. And then you'll want to teach them to use context clues to make meaning of new words as they encounter while reading the words they already know. Teaching approaches you can use to use direct vocabulary instruction are charades, which are great for English language learners who speak little to no English. 20 questions as they start learning more English. You can use word webs and word association games to make connections between words they already know and new words that they are learning. And then you can use, of course, multimodal supports that we already talked about. You can use images, realia, videos, gestures as you teach. These can all help students better understand new vocabulary.
It's also very important to build and maintain background knowledge of your students. So we encourage you as educators to make connections between what your student already knows and what they need to learn. So some examples of that include directly teaching you vocabulary and concepts. And for example, another approach would be a personalized dictionary or a glossary that your student might have. Concept maps are also, according to research, are also very effective in order to sort of build and maintain background knowledge.
You also can provide comprehensible input to your students. Comprehensible input may be a new term for you, but it's simply language input that can be understood by listeners despite them not understanding all the words and structures in it. It's typically described as I+1, which indicates that you are using text that is one level above where the learner is linguistically. So if the learner can understand the text completely, that is the level they are at. You want one level above that, where they can understand the gist and the meaning of it, but maybe not every single word. Comprehensible input encourages students to use context clues to learn new words, to infer meaning from a text, and to learn new words and grammatical structures. If you can incorporate this with text, with your speaking during your instruction, and the videos that you use. It does require intentional planning, but it is possible to do. Images are a great support if you're using I+1 text or text that provide comprehensible input, and tools that you can help shorten text and lessen words for your English language learners that may not be at the level of your other students are textcompactor.com and rewordify.com. Text Compactor will shorten a text and make a summary, and you can choose the level you want it to be at. And rewordify.com will change texts that have complex vocabulary to simpler vocabulary.
It's also very important to incorporate student interaction and peer tutoring. So according to research, student-centered learning, it promotes social engagement, it increases time on task, and it decreases disruptive behaviors that may occur. It also helps your ELLs perform better on content area tests, and in general, it just improves their attitude.
Student interaction activities can include jigsaw grouping or think, pair, share as you get students to work together and do different activities together. Some other activities you can use are peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS. In this strategy, one student reads aloud while the other listens and then gives feedback through structured activities such as describing the main idea, retailing the story, summarizing, or predicting what happens next. But when any of these activities, you really need to be careful with your grouping of students. At times, it may be working with your English language learners, but at other times, it may be more beneficial if the English language learner works with a native English speaker. So you just really need to be intentional about that and think what would be best for your students as you plan your student groups.
Just to summarize some takeaway points from today, it takes your ELL on average 5 to 7 years to learn academic language, and it's also very important to consider your ELL's culture, beliefs, and background. It's also very important to consider multimodal learning for your ELL and how their English develops as a result of that. And some specific strategies that we discussed today would be direct vocabulary instruction, building and maintaining background knowledge, providing comprehensible input, I+1, and incorporating student interaction and peer tutoring.
Now we're going to do an activity that puts you in the place of a language learner. Norm is going to conduct a lesson where we read a text that's not in English, and he's going to demonstrate how important it is to use supports for your learners that do not speak the language.
Sad ću vam pokazati jednu finu priču. Glava, rame, noge, prsti. Broj 1. Glava, rame, noge, prsti, noge, prsti. Broj 2. Glava, rame, noge, prsti, noge, prsti. Broj 3.
I don't think anyone can understand you. Is there anything you could do to give us more support?
Yes, I think I could use gestures and I could show images.
Let's try that.
Glava, glava, prsti, prsti, rame, rame, noge, noge, glava, glava, nos, nos, usta, usta, oči, oči, uši, uši. Sad zajedno. Glava, glava,
Glava,
prsti, prsti,
prsti,
rame, rame,
rame,
noge, noge.
noge.
Very good. Sad zajedno. Glava, glava,
Glava,
nos, nos,
nos,
usta, usta,
usta,
oči, oči,
oči,
uši, uši.
uši.
Sad još jednom zajedno. Glava,
Glava,
rame,
rame,
noge,
noge,
prsti,
prsti,
noge,
noge,
prsti.
prsti.